Force will carry my reason. As we stared through the warp hole, I heard those words again. Reborn and united under Kron. I swear, the League can never be prepared for what we're about to unleash.
The First Colony War had come to an end by the year 4620. Through great cost and sacrifice, the Earth Empire managed to thwart the invasion of the Sol System by the League of Free Worlds, forcing them to retreat through the warp hole they came through. But in a final act of defiance, the League sealed the warp hole behind them, effectively trapping the peoples of the Earth Empire within its own home system. And without the resources that Earth and its colonies needed to survive from outside the Sol System, the League had effectively doomed the people of Sol to a slow and agonizing death via starvation. The year is now 4669. The Empire had died out as the League had hoped. However, the people of Sol did not. Since the warp hole closure, they had devolved into different tribes, and were engaged in a seemingly endless civil war with one another, fighting over the diminishing scraps of the Sol System like starving dogs. But by 4669, a leader had arisen from the unending spiral of self-destruction. Kron. Kron had emerged from the ashes of the First Colony War and moved to carve a significant power base for himself. He captured the hearts and minds of many within the new generation who were raised upon the notion that the evil League of Free Worlds had brought ruin upon the people of Sol. And with that power, Kron began rebuilding Earth's decimated colonial navy around one principle. The time for suffering is over. The time for vengeance is now. However, before any action against the League of Free Worlds could be taken, Kron had to rebuild the old Sol battle platform that could reopen the warp hole that led out system. But first, he needed to solidify his forces and subjugate those few remaining barbaric tribes of Sol that would not join his righteous crusade. But as defiant as the tribals were, they could not stand against the colonial navy resurgent under Kron. Battle after battle was met with victory after victory, and eventually the Civil War would climax at the engagement of the Sol battle platform, where the tribals made a desperate attack with the last of their forces against the navy while they labored to complete work on the platform. But like countless battles before, the tribals were obliterated by the colonial navy defenders. With this victory, the last of the old tribes were utterly crushed, and unity had returned to Sol under the visionary leadership of Kron and the might of his fist. With the battle platform secure, the colonial navy rallied as the warp hole opened for the first time in decades. As Kron himself stated, "Force will carry my reason," which was a sentiment shared with the proud service members of the colonial navy, and they would carry their reason right to the heart of League High Command. The Gallonigher system. Emerging from the warp hole into Gallonigher, the League of Free Worlds remained unaware of the enemy at the gates, which was what Kron desired, for now. The colonial navy was still vastly outnumbered by the League. They needed to strike fast and cause as much disruption and mayhem as they could before the League fleets mobilized to crush them. System-wide communications rigs, spy satellite deployment installations, and other targets of opportunity fell before the savagery of colonial fighters and capital ships, their crews lusting for blood after a century of isolated suffering caused by the League. As the attacks continued, Kron and his fleet were intent on finding the League command bases before they were alerted to his presence. Time was running out, but League command just had to be here somewhere in Gallonigher. As the battles across the system escalated, the League took notice. Soon they began rallying their forces and hitting the colonial lines hard, with some accounts saying that the League fleet were actually able to push the colonial navy back to Sol, where only a tenacious defense and the usage of a super gun against League capital ships managed to springboard the navy back into Gallonigher and back on the offensive. But the colonial navy's hard work was for naught. It was discovered that the League was no longer based in Gallonigher. Apparently, they had moved their center of government elsewhere sometime during the isolation in the Sol system. Kron was furious. His intelligence agents had failed him utterly, and he would take the appropriate measures to punish them, undoubtedly with fatal consequences. But this was just the start of the cracks beginning to appear in the colonial navy, which were furthered as a new faction had arisen among their ranks: the Watch. An agency created by Kron himself that seemingly had authority over everyone and everything in the Navy. Essentially, they were Kron's secret police, designed to weed out disloyalty and treachery. They recruited those they wanted by force, and those who refused, well, they would find themselves having an inconvenient accident with an airlock. When the Colonial Navy moved into the Cronus system to continue their hunt for the League High Command, their power within the Navy slowly but steadily grew. But the war pressed on. It had to. Now the Navy was in the Cronus system, ready to continue their battles against the vile League of Free Worlds and ascertain the true location of their cowardly leadership. But unlike Gallonigher, where the Navy had the element of surprise, here in Cronus the League fleets were fully mobilized and ready for them. Now that they were on even footing, this was when the real war would begin. All across the system the Navy attacked, the League defended. Then the League would counter with an offensive of their own, the Navy would match them. The fighting was brutal, but eventually, slowly, the League was pushed out of Cronus and were forced to regroup at the next system, Alpha Centauri. Kron and the Colonial Navy, however, battered and bruised as they were not content to simply consolidate their gains before pushing further. The Great Crusade of Vengeance would continue without pause. By the time the Navy had begun to fight the League in Alpha Centauri, the Watch was able to dictate overall strategy. Reports were unconfirmed as to the actual Navy losses at the time, but morale was suffering due to the Watch blaming operational setbacks on the starfighter pilots themselves, the backbone of the Navy's force projection. Some among the pilot corps even hinted that the real cause for the Navy's setbacks was because of the Watch's grand strategies that ended in failure. Surely Kron would know what was truly happening among his forces. But still the service members of the Colonial Navy carried on, eager to bring ruin to the League of Free Worlds that had imprisoned them and had caused so much suffering for the people of Sol. These thoughts alone were enough to carry them through the arduous days ahead. Victories and defeats were tallied for the Navy as the pendulum of war between the two adversaries continually went back and forth. But as the Alpha Centauri campaign continued, the Watch grew more erratic and paranoid, especially as more evidence mounted that there was a spy, or spies, among their ranks feeding the League intelligence on Navy movements and positions. However, their time was coming to an end, even if they did not know it. There are at least two probable stories that detail the downfall of the Watch. One was during an attack on a civilian convoy that supposedly held the spies and traitors the Watch so desperately sought, but the other hinted at events that would transpire later on near the end of the Second Colony War. This second story involves a man named Mertens, a pilot for the Colonial Navy who was arrested by the Watch for allegedly seditious actions against Kron and the Navy. What these actions specifically were is not known exactly, and range from failing to kill a traitor to aiding and supporting an operation to destroy a League fleet that unknowingly had a number of Watch agents inside. And now, with Watch fighters towing his ship to their space station in Alpha Centauri, it seemed Mertens' career would be grounded permanently. But fate had other plans. A League destroyer jumped into the area of operations and began assaulting the Watch facility. Seemingly left with little choice, the Watch fighters towing Mertens' ship released him, on the grounds that he was ordered to stand and fight off the League ship alongside them. Mertens was fortunately an ace pilot in his own right, and fell into old habits easily by dispatching the destroyer's fighter escort, followed by the destroyer herself. And then yet another turn of fate. As the embers of the League capital ship began to fade into the void, Mertens received a transmission from Navy intelligence that he needed to destroy the Watch station. This was then followed by a message on his flight computer from Navy operations that the Watch leader who was aboard the station, a woman named Bex, was now assigned the status of traitor. Mertens happily obliged with his order to destroy the Watch station that just a few hours ago could very well have been his tomb. Bex, unwilling to go down without a fight, shot out of the station as it exploded and began dueling Mertens. But as the two pilots fought, Bex would speak over the comms about how she had no choice and that things are not what they first appear to be. And even damning still was her hints about another entity waiting around the corner. But Mertens paid little heed, perhaps believing them to be the rants of a woman wishing to avoid death. He simply gained the advantage on Bex and gunned down her Watch fighter. Whatever secrets she held about the future died with her. Upon Mertens' return to the Navy, he was greeted with a wonderful surprise at his debriefing. The Watch was disbanded. As it turned out, they participated in many actions that were completely unjustifiable and would no longer be a factor in this Second Colony War. Even worse still for the former agency, it was revealed by Kron himself that Bex, the Watch's leader, was forwarding information to the League of Free Worlds. So in all likelihood, she was the culprit behind the leaks about Navy assets and positions that the Watch as an organization worked to stem. If those Navy service members who fell victim to the Watch's Inquisition were still alive, surely they would have appreciated the irony. But as the enemy within was crushed, so too did Alpha Centauri capitulate to the Colonial Navy, and with the Navy's recent successes, the home system of the hated League of Free Worlds was found. Boreas. Finally, the time for vengeance that Kron had promised his followers was upon them. The Colonial Navy had entered Boreas. Their first spearhead assault had brought them into the system, and fighting between the two eternal foes was vicious. If this was to be the League's final stand, then they would not go willingly into the night. And yet again, fate proved to be mercurial. Reports from the front lines began coming in. Unknown alien battleships were beginning to appear in Boreas, attacking both Navy and League forces. At first, it started with reports of unknown jamming signal technology being used, followed by confirmed sightings. One such sighting happened during the recovery of a crippled Navy frigate by Allied forces. Another sighting during a tense battle between the League and Navy over a jump gate leading to a League installation. Arguably, their most significant appearance was during the latter operation. When the Navy took the jump gate, they quickly warped to the League station. Emerging in front of the League installation, the Navy fighters and the destroyer that accompanied them were eager to do battle once more with their hated nemesis. That was until an unknown alien ship that looked like something that came out of a nebula called a garden uncloaked right on top of the League space station. Wasting no time, the unknown gutted the station with its energy beam weaponry, turning the League's asset into an exploding fireball in short time. But they soon proved themselves to not be allies of the Colonial Navy either, as they just as quickly turned their guns on the Navy destroyer. But the followers of Kron would not be cowed by seemingly vast and unknown firepower. Leaping forth without fear, the Navy fighters assaulted the alien capital ship, battering its hull until it too joined its League victim in the vastness of space, as flaming debris. Upon hearing these reports, Kron was concerned, and despite murmurings among his forces that they should focus on this new alien aggressor over fighting the League of Free Worlds, Kron was adamant that the true enemy is, was, and always will be the League. One saving grace the human forces had against the new alien menace was that they were not at full strength yet, and the ships they had encountered so far were merely spearhead units, ships designed to go into a system first to soften up the defenders before the full might of the fleet could be brought in. Therefore, the herd needed to be culled before that happened. The Colonial Navy threw themselves onto the task, as the League fleets did the same elsewhere. While the battles against their collective foe raged on, both the League and the Navy proved that age-old adage whose origin was long since lost to history. If it bleeds, we can kill it. And the number of alien battleships in system were thinned immensely in a short period of time. Further operations against the aliens were undertaken, such as one to capture their technology to learn more about the alien menace, and another was conducted to prevent an alien scheme to use a super energy beam that had the power to destroy whole planets. All the while, skirmishes against the League continued, as per Kron's orders. His war would not be delayed. But it was becoming clear that fighting a two-sided war was a losing affair. Again, cries for negotiations with the League reached Kron's ears, and yet still he refused. Vengeance was the only goal worth pursuing. His commanders and other high-ranking personnel disagreed. Ever since they entered Boreas, Kron had seemingly become more unstable, and was overeager to take extreme methods with his subordinates, even as they brought him victory. Kron's recent change in attitude alienated the Navy he built, and so many Colonial Command personnel went behind his back and began active negotiations with the League. In the face of this new alien menace and the terrifying power they wielded, their conflict was meaningless, and only by uniting could they have the slimmest of chances to fight and win, or face extinction. Soon after, it was discovered where the aliens were warping into Boreas from. They were coming from a temporal warp hole maintained by a space structure simply known as a web lock. If this web lock could be destroyed, their warp hole would close and the aliens would no longer be able to enter Boreas. Subsequent recon missions were planned and the alien portal was found, An offensive was quickly planned and implemented shortly after. As the colonial fleet carved a path in blood to the alien warpole, a single pilot was given the honor of closing it. Mertens, the pilot who helped bring down the Watch. Blazing through the opened route forward, he attacked the jewel-like structure, and upon its destruction, caused the warpole to collapse. I'm not talking about the Simon Says puzzle for the weblog, they blew it up, the end. With the destruction of the alien warpole and the threat to their collective existence ended, so too did the war between the Colonial Navy and the League of Free Worlds. A truce was finally ratified that bound all Navy and League forces to honor the cessation of hostilities. But Kron refused. He had become mad at the denial of his rightful vengeance against the League of Free Worlds and the betrayal of his navy. Gathering the last of his most loyal followers, he rallied them around a superweapon that presumably he had hoped to use against the League. A supergun, much like the one that defended Sol earlier in the war against the League. This time though, if his navy would choose to side with his most hated enemies, then he would simply kill everyone. By aiming his supergun at the Boreas sun, he could do just that in one killing blow. Obviously, the Colonial Navy could not let that happen. Their first task was to assault Kron's personal battleship, and have their fighters use their leech beams, specialized weaponry made for draining energy shields and in this case, steal data, to ascertain the location of Kron's supergun. From there it would be a mad dash to the weapon of destruction before Kron fired it, which the Navy fortunately did, catching Kron and his superweapon by surprise as they were readying to fire. The timing was impeccable as Navy fighters attacked to stop the destruction of the system, eventually prevailing over Kron's loyalists and destroying their ace in the hole. But as for the man himself, he had fled quickly aboard his dreadnought once the Navy found his supergun. Kron was on the run, a fugitive from his own empire now allied with his most hated enemy. Him, his command ship, and a small number of his most loyal followers were all that remained. But they could not evade the baleful eye of the Colonial Navy, and were found fleeing the Boreas system as vengeful Navy ships finally caught up with them. Kron's personal dreadnought command craft, mighty as it was unable to suffer the wrath of his ex-followers and fell quickly to their energy weapon bombardment. But Kron was not done yet. Fleeing in his personal voodoo starfighter, he warped out, hoping to escape his inevitable downfall one last time. But what he didn't know was that Mertens, in a voodoo of his own, was not far behind him. Emerging into normal space once again, the two began a vicious dogfight. Kron begged Mertens to not kill him, but instead to join Kron and finish the war they started by ending the League. Mertens flatly refused, stating that Kron betrayed everyone for his own personal gain. And in response, Kron simply replied that he had no choice, and that he was just a pawn for the League left to rot. But whatever implications Kron's final words had were quickly forgotten in the heat of battle, and not long after, in a climactic finish, Mertens brought an end to the one man who unified Sol and rebuilt an empire on the foundation of revenge against their enemies. With Kron dead, there was time for the League of Free Worlds to inform their former adversaries of who Kron really was, and no one within the Colonial Navy would have guessed as to the story the League would tell. Kron once served with the League of Free Worlds during the final battle for Sol in the First Colony War all those years ago. Near the conflict's end, Kron had grown to be unstable and dangerous, much as he became in this Second Colony War. The father, who was the leader of the League of Free Worlds, perhaps unwilling to execute one of his own, personally had Kron undertake one last dangerous mission as the League was retreating from Sol. If he survived, then he would be exiled permanently in the isolated system, which is mostly what happened. But no sentient being in the galaxy could have predicted that he would raise an army to break out of the Sol system and take revenge on the father. When Kron spoke of vengeance to the suffering people of Sol, they assumed that he was speaking of retribution against those who imprisoned them in their own solar system. But there were only ever a means for Kron to take his own revenge on the father for what he did to him. Nothing else mattered. And yet still, despite the self-serving wishes of their leader, Kron's vengeance war gave the people of Sol a great gift: their freedom. This is where the story of the Second Colony War ends, but during the course of the latter half of the war, another event of great significance was playing out, one that involved another unknown alien menace and all of humanity: the Red Sun Incident. But that's a tale for another day.